It's an extinction. I cannot change that future, even if I know that I will live in a world without glaciers.
So I have this direct experience of somebody in a small case just saying that flat out no. In the venture scale, like there's this thinking that...
Okay, so this is the one time today that we are not going to be taking questions on Slido. We're going to be taking questions live from the audience. And our 4 speakers that are here today, well, the 3 that are on stage right now, we have Marcie Murray from Shopify, we have Marcela Fernandez from Selina, we have Andreas Klinger from AngelList, and we have Adii Pienaar from Convergio. So welcome to these speakers. I know that we probably all still have some burning questions, even though we've learned a lot the past day and a half. So how this is going to work is we are going to form a line or a queue of people who want to come up and ask questions, and I will hand you a microphone and you should introduce yourself, just say your name and ask your question. And so please make it an actual question that our speakers can ask, and keep it short and sweet and to the point. So if you need a little bit of time to formulate your question, you can wait a little bit and then come up. All right, so a couple, yes. Oh, Jesse, all right, first.
This is specifically for Shopify. I'm just curious why you target cities. I had the question on the panel the other day, so you might recognize it, but as opposed to like rural communities where you might have more impact, both as a hiring brand or whatever you called it, and like socioeconomically.
That's a great question. So it's not that we don't target them, it's just that we don't target them to begin with. And so our global expansion has really followed pockets of time zones that would allow us to have people working in their daytime hours. So there's some rural communities that don't necessarily line up with some of the time zones that we necessarily need to hire in. But when we actually want to develop a concentration of sort of ambassadors for our brand, or whatever you want to call it, but it's really important, like the first priority of our strategy is that we're able to find a concentration of people within a community so that they can develop a culture together as it relates to the community that they're working within. That community needs to line up in a time zone that would allow them to work in their daytime hours. And it has to have other criteria in terms of hitting talent requirements, because I'm not going into a community and hiring 5 people. I'm going into a community with the plan of hiring hundreds of people. And so having a plan that would hit all the time zone requirements, hit the community requirements, hit the talent requirements, has to be it has to be also a very deliberate, targeted ad strategy as well. And to do that in some very remote communities, you just wouldn't actually hit the talent at the volume that I actually need for our business. And so it might be different if I was only looking for 4 or 5 people kind of thing. I could definitely put my even my brand marketing resources into something like that. But at the scale that which we're hiring, it doesn't necessarily make sense. That's sort of like the first priority when we're developing it. The second one is that we allow I shouldn't say allow, but we have sort of the sort of tentacles that come out of our branches thereafter. So if I take even the west coast of Canada, for example, if anybody's familiar with the province of British Columbia, we actually started in Victoria, which is not the biggest city there. And then now we're in almost all of the cities, including the remote cities across British Columbia. So the opportunity to bring jobs to rural and remote communities is definitely there, but it wouldn't be there without the sort of the foundation being laid in some of the larger communities that actually bring brand awareness to us as an employer. And so that's kind of why, because we also have to consider the scale and the talent that's actually available in the various communities at that scale.
Hi, I'm Shireen Wafei. I'm the co-founder of Scale Up Ventures, but I'm also a user experience researcher. My question's for Andreas. You've worked with engineering teams all over the world. How do you integrate the user experience process or the design and research process in that flow?
I'm not sure if I'm the right person to answer. I constantly struggle doing that right. So what we have is cross-functional teams. Mm-hmm. So there's a project, and everybody who needs to be in that project to make it work is actually in there. So that usually includes UX, design, developer, maybe customer care people. Very often design has the lead. Mm-hmm. It really depends on the product. But to be honest, we always struggle doing this right, so I don't really have a good answer yet. Maybe I learned it from you, I don't know.
Yeah, because I mean, I'm just starting to try and do more remote work, but sometimes you need to be in the country where the users are. So things like Hotjar, for example, helps a lot when it comes to research, but actually physically being present.
Yeah, we use metrics a ton, full contact, Hotjar, this kind of stuff a ton, interviews, like all of this stuff, like obvious, but we didn't discover any like magic formula or any magic process that really nails it.
Okay.
But yeah,
Right,
still in the
so
process of learning.
I found a niche then I can work on.
That's right.
Definitely.
Hi, Shannon from Epic Teams. My question is for Marcie, but also Andreas and anyone else who'd like to ask. Yesterday you said performance success is team-based. And then Zach had mentioned earlier that he doesn't do OKRs because they're individual-based. He'd rather do team-based goals. So I just want to know if you could speak a little bit about team-based performance goals for distributed teams.
So it's important to keep in mind that the majority of my team is actually frontline support teams. So they're doing live interactions on phones and chats primarily. That's sort of the majority of their time, probably at least 60% of their time in any given day. And at least with our business in particular, if you were to sort of take our business and our model of our team and put it into a building, it would actually look and smell and feel a lot like a contact center. And so one of the things that we've really resisted is traditional contact center metrics, whereby the individual is really only evaluated on their success of their sort of productivity KPIs. So handle times, resolve rates, silence times, there's a laundry list of them. But with our business in particular, the questions that our customers have are really not a one and done. They can be extremely complex, and they often lead to sort of a trail of other questions. So you can have a merchant who says, how come I'm not making any sales? Or what happened to my checkout conversion? Did you guys do something to your code? And really it could be that they installed an app and it did something that was different to like how they were ranking, or they changed their theme and now the majority of their product images are falling below the fold. Like there's so much that actually goes on there. And so when you look at the individual sort of productivity metrics or the success metrics, a frontline support guru can't actually control what's dealt to them. Like it's all reactive, warm contacts. And so to measure somebody on their individual performance sort of stack ranks them against another individual, and they can't control like what's coming to them on the other end. So what we want for people to do is sort of do their best work together. And given that there's such a breadth of information that they're responsible for covering, we sort of evaluate CSAT on a team base so that it's a little bit more aggregated across a larger sample. We look at all of the productivity metrics that way as well. And then we look at sort of the impact to businesses, so sort of the customer success metrics on an even broader scale, like a whole team. So like a team of teams, if that makes any sense. It's almost 100 people across the board. And I think like what that does is it allows people a little bit more breathing room to just kind of do the right thing and not be so caught up in like, did I hit this checkbox on this particular thing, because they are sort of transactional based conversations. So, I mean, it's never going to be perfect. I kind of talk about it in more of an idealist sense because we're always going to be working towards making it a lot better. But yeah, I think that especially in the customer support world, when you get down to sort of evaluating success on an individual basis, very rarely does it have to do with anything successful. It has everything to do with how productive somebody is, and I really want the team to be oriented towards the impact to the customer, not their impact to the budget.
I will answer more like at a company level, engineering level, in our case. AngelList, we do OKRs, but we actually, we actually discovered the same thing, that the individual connecting to metrics a little bit harder. So what we do is we basically break down from like company level OKRs to unit OKRs to project OKRs, and the project has an OKR. Like there's a reason why we do each project, and it's connected to a metric, it's connected to a goal or objective. The individual, like one person leads this project, but not necessarily like every person is connected to this one metric. It depends on which projects you work on and so on and so on. What we do for individual evaluation is peer reviews very religiously. They have a part where each person feedbacks each person, also a part where each person tries to give suggestions to like management or like just other things they might not want to like share publicly to this person. And additionally, we do an internal scoring system, basically like who had the most impact from your point of view this quarter, and also like who was the most helpful for your work in this quarter. So basically to acknowledge outlier performance and acknowledge outlier teamwork. That's what we do basically.
In Selina, very short, we're trying to do collaborative goals. So for example, the goal of HR, one of the goals, is to recruit this year 2,000 people. It is a lot. We have a great team of recruiters, but if market research, the department, helps us and sends us referrals, and we actually hire people because market research send a lot of people to us, they get part of our goal, right? So it's like a gamification. Or HR can help market research to fill more than 1,000 surveys that they need per city. So we start working on, by knowing the goals of the company and gamifying that through collaboration, we're competing less against departments.
How many people are you currently planning?
We are 2,000.
How many do you say you plan to hire?
Doubling the size.
Oh, shit.
Yes.
So I'd love to add, because I am the least most process-driven leader and founder ever. So we do something very closely to, so in Xhosa in South Africa, there's a concept called Ubuntu, and the basic concept is I am because we are, right? And so because I think it is very, very hard cross disciplines on a team to be able to assign specific goals or metrics related to performance to those, right? I mean, if you take engineer, and if they bash out a task because they're really good in 10 minutes, and another engineer does that in an hour, is the one good, is the other bad? I don't know. And for me as a mostly non-technical founder, that's impossible to do. So we implement a very simple kind of profit sharing bonus scheme for the team, which is basically like every retreat that we go on, and we only recently implement this because we've only recently been like comfortably profitable to be able to do this. But the idea then is very simple, which is we try and allocate the maximum amount we can of profit to a bonus pot to the team, right? And I say maximum amount because we obviously have strategic endeavors to grow. And then that pot is shared, I think the last time we did it was 70% of that pot is shared equally across the whole team, and 30% is shared based on tenure, right? So the longer you're in team, you get slightly more than someone that joined within the last year. And the basis of that is just like, if we as a team are mostly pulling in the same direction, we're also mostly kind of contributing towards success of the team. And I think the only caveat to that is the one thing to be aware of is that you don't have those kind of team members that are just piggybacking on others' great work, right? So you have to make sure that team members that aren't aligned or not pulling their weight, they either need to be transitioned out or be kind of mentored upwards to pull their weight. But as I said, I am because we are.
Loved hearing all those different approaches, but all around a very similar theme, right? We're all collaborating, we're all working together, and creating some sort of structure that honors that, I think, is important in any remote team.
Quickly to add to this, every generation improves on this. Like we use the techniques of Intel, then Google, then Facebook, and other companies. Every generation tries to improve how we actually manage knowledge work. A lot of the patterns we use still come from factories. Like a lot of the mindset still comes from factory where you know what you're doing and nothing will change and you just need to optimize. A lot of the management comes out of that. A lot of the principles, how you evaluate, come out of that. And I think every generation iterates how you do knowledge worker performance and management. So if you don't know how to do this right, that's kind of like the same for everybody, and everybody tries to figure it out what works for them.
Hi, good day. Name is Rodre. I'm working from the Philippines. All right, and even if you guys can answer the question, as a leader, business owners, we all know it's 2019, and maybe 5 to 10 years from now, we all know the AI stuff, automation. So what are your suggestions or recommendations for the freelancers like me, for example, to have our work or our job future-proof?
You should get me to talk about this when I've had a couple of glasses of wine. I'm a technologist at heart. I believe that whenever we pass the Turing test, that's going to happen sometime soon, right? I don't think we will ever be able to replicate a full human being, and whatever you want to call that, whether it's soul, whatever, there's part of this that you can't programmatically replicate. And I think as freelancers, as businesses, those that retain the human connection will always win and will always be relevant. Doesn't matter what kind of AI we use to augment that, but that will be the differentiator and USP.
To counter that, I believe we already passed the Turing test. If you look on Twitter, I sometimes don't know if it's like an automated script or just a really stupid person. And no offense to people in anywhere. The main thing that we as human are really good is in adapting. And I think that the time is gone when you have one kind of job. So I work as I don't know, a communication expert or whatever. And like I work in this kind of specific industry. It's like it's very adapting, it's very changing, and this is one thing that humans can. Our grandparents used to have one job their whole life. We have now, like, let's say, a job every 2 years or 1 year, maybe. And maybe in future we have like jobs every 6 months. You know, it like really depends. I think that the strong skill that we as humans have is adapting and like learning how to adapt.
I think that getting out of whatever your vision of the future is important. For example, I recently learned, 6 months ago, that we will live with a world without glaciers. And Colombia, my country, has 6 glaciers, they're disappearing. That has nothing to do with my profession, but I can change that, or at least understand that they are not going to be there, and today they are, and I can do something, but I cannot, it's an extinction. I cannot change that future, even if I know that I will live in a world without glaciers. And that's just get out of whatever you're doing and understand how the future of other things are going to change.
So one of my favorite people and founders, his name is Rick Nucci, and he founded a company, multiple companies, but the most recent one is called Guru, oddly enough, because that's our team name. He does a really good job, and some of his talks are available online about talking about how AI actually just makes like everybody's jobs better. And it really sort of, what he really focuses on is exactly your question. And so I'm so glad you asked it, because it is a very human question, and it's a very real question, and it's a very common concern for a lot of people. And a lot of people, I think, are afraid to ask it because it sort of gets their identity wrapped up in not wanting to move forward with technology, which they're supposed to embrace. And so if you're able to find any of his talks online, I suggest you watch them. But one question that he sort of left me with once, because he's actually building AI technology that would essentially make some people feel like their jobs are going to be replaced. He says everybody should be thinking about it as, how would AI actually make my job better? Like, so what parts, if you were in full control of the AI, like which parts of your job would you love to have augmented by AI to some degree? And that sort of gives you like that 20% that could kind of be augmented, and then how do you actually take that spectrum and then continue to move on in your own journey with your own job? So it's sort of leading it a little bit forward. So rather than being afraid of it, there's probably, if you look introspectively, there's probably things that you would love to have supplemented in what you do right now. So that's probably the first place to start thinking about it.
Actually, my question is aimed at you, Andreas, but I think it's relevant to everybody. But you talked yesterday about trust and how you think all of the common problems that remote teams face boil down to trust. One of the challenges that we've faced is, how do we increase trust, but more particularly, how do we repair trust when it's been damaged? And I'm curious how people have approached that and what they've seen succeed.
You mean like when a project is messed up, or like if people actually don't deliver or don't stay to their, like what they say they should do and all this kind of stuff?
Well, I don't think trust is a fixed state.
Yeah, fair enough.
So sometimes you trust people more or less, and sometimes people might take actions or misinterpret things which might damage that trust relationship. And one of the challenges that we've faced is it's tricky to rebuild that in a virtual environment. You know, I can't just grab them and take them outside or whatever and have a drink with them.
I mean, I don't have a magic answer here, but like for me, it's very important, where does let's call it like a problem, like a situation, where does the situation come from? Like, was the context wrong? Like, which was my fault in a way, or like the general team fault? Or did this person actually make the bad decisions? You know, like, for example, not asking the right people early on and this kind of stuff. That can be fixed, that can be trained and all this kind of stuff. Does it come from like just non-motivation, malintent, or anything like that? Sometimes that can be fixed, sometimes not. In those cases, I question myself why I didn't even hire this person. Like, that can happen. At AngelList, we have like a rule, like we hire people for good judgment. And if people lack judgment, they might not be a good fit, because a lot of the stuff that we require people to do is like having ownership and autonomous decisions. And sometimes people are not the right fit for that. And sometimes it's because something is missing, and sometimes it's because they don't have the right motivation or like the right goals or vision or values. In the first case, you can fix. In the second case, you can find something else for them to work at, like a different company.
Hi, my name is Kevin. Question for Andreas as well. I don't know if this was addressed in any of the talks, but investing in remote-first companies or companies outside of the US, what are the thoughts about where the company is incorporated? Is it an issue for US investors if a company is Australian, incorporated in Australia, etc.? What's the thoughts on that sort of issue?
So everybody who's in the US will tell you should incorporate in Delaware Inc., period, for the simple reason that investors understand it. They have their everything set up. They don't have to question anything. They don't have to ask the lawyer. They can instantly make a decision. That being said, I know a lot of companies that were very successful with international corporations. It really depends, obviously. I know of cases, like I did like an invite-only conference in Vienna. We invited like the founders of Reddit, Twitch, and like you name it, like everybody. And one of them actually really liked an Austrian startup. He wanted to invest. And then he found out that he has to discuss with his lawyer how to actually make the deal. He said like to me, this might need up to 4 hours. And I was like, okay. And he was like, no, I mean, I can't do that. I was like, okay. Because like from his point of view, he wanted to invest like 50K or something like that, which from his point of view is just like, let's give it a try. And he didn't want to like go through all this paperwork to making sure there's like something weird happening. So I have this direct experience of somebody in a small case just saying that flat out no. In the venture scale, like there's this thinking that even if it limits the probability by 10%, this 10% might be the reason why you don't have a multiple in outcome. So personally, if I would go for a direct venture case, I would most likely incorporate a Delaware Inc.
Cool, thank you.
I can answer. I tend to agree, right? But as context, so Convergio is a UK corporation. Mm-hmm. I've been exclusively based in South Africa. We've got investors from South Africa, from the UK, from Europe, from the US. All angel investors, only one institutional fund. I don't think it's that much of a problem. It's probably a problem when you want to raise Series A and Series B money, right? And you need just a wider pool of institutional investors, yes. Right? Because those are in the UK. Europe, it's not at the level of the US, right? But if you're trying to raise a little bit of, and when I say a little bit, we raised $500,000. That's not a little bit of money, right? I think you can do that in most reputable places in the world, where the investors at least know that, listen here, like, if I need to sue you, I can sue you, as an example.
Angels are usually more flexible because they anyway already have to trust you, like on a different level. Most institutional investors actually try to prepare everything for their pipeline, like follow-on investors and all this kind of stuff. And they don't want to like at Series B or C run into huge problems because of something they forgot early on, or have like one of their major big partners they're trying to actually work together with all of a sudden say, hey, what, that's a French whatever kind of entity, you know? We have so many entities in Europe, for example. Every country is really obsessed about that being the main entity. Like we have Bulgarian OOD, German GmbH, UK Limited, you name it. Outside of the Europe, everybody's just confused, like how many we have and what's going on. My strong opinion is, for example, in Europe, we need a European Inc. as soon as possible to actually solve this kind of problem, at least from a European point of view. But like to answer your question, I agree with him. Angels, like doesn't matter almost. VC case, venture case. Get a Delaware Inc.
Cool, appreciate it.
So I have a remote team. I'm going to be moving remote away from them, different time zone. Just hired somebody in different time zone, thinking of getting rid of the office altogether. I've heard a lot about culture and communication, but what do you guys think about flexible working hours in terms of productivity, in terms of happiness? Do you have like opinions or data on that? And also working across different time zones? I'm just curious about the logistics of that so I can make a good decision.
My experience here is there's like almost like this philosophy split in the remote scene. You have like people who work with overlapping time zones, like synchronous, and you have people who like work asynchronous, like with non-overlapping time zones. In my experience, even in the teams that are asynchronous, like in the companies that are asynchronous, very often individual teams work synchronous. So they have like their mobile team in Asia or something like that, like with roughly enough time zone overlap. Personally, we only hired between West Coast and Eastern Europe. In San Francisco, everybody got up at 5 to 7 a.m. and everybody in Eastern Europe stayed up a little bit longer. I strongly believe that's necessary. And like regarding flexible hours, I have no strong opinion. I work whenever.
I mean, so I think for me, I'll at least kind of promote my own talk, 2 talks from now. Culture, I think, is important because you can do many of the things with culture when you're not there, right? So culture can act as you when you're not there if you have a strong culture. I think that's the first thing. And just on kind of flexible working days, right? I have a small team, and the best example I have is one of our senior engineers lives in Lisbon, and he decided to move to Australia for 6 months, and it kind of sucked for the rest of us for those 6 months. Not because he wasn't contributing, because it was a little bit harder to communicate. And I think that ultimately just comes down to what you're optimizing for. If you want to be the most like brutal, hustling, like efficient machine, and like you want to IPO like your company, then probably don't do that. If you want a happy team and you want to be remote in that sense and do the thing, if you want to be able to move away, then like I'm of the strong opinion, like the leader of the team, if he does that, the team should be able to do the same thing. Then you optimize for that.
Yeah, in our case, I mean, we do have flexible hours, but we are a startup, and I can guarantee you that somebody that works in Selina that doesn't like the 9-to-5 job will work more than the 9-to-5. Even as an employee, we have 4 headquarters: London, Tel Aviv, Panama, and New York, 4 different time zones. We, by being in Tel Aviv and having Israel founders, usually Friday is a day that we respect for Shabbat, for those who are abroad. So Sunday become the day that in Latin America people rest, and sometimes they have to sacrifice. So it's finding the moments where you don't have to sacrifice that much, but understanding that more than the flexible hours is the flexibility that sometimes your Sunday might not be the ideal Sunday that you had before when you didn't have the Israel team, for example.
How many people do you have on your team?
7.
Yeah. Like, why don't you just ask them what they want to do, and then like maybe figure out, you can have 4 flexible days and one that's sort of inflexible, so that you bring everybody together. Like, I'm not sure, and maybe it's a very naive answer, but you could also just sort of sit down together and think, hey, what are the most important things that we need to accomplish, and does flexibility address that? And if there's certain parts of flexibility that doesn't address that, then maybe everybody has to compromise that, 20% of their week isn't as flexible.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious because we have it good now when we're all in one time zone, but starting to build the systems and scaling and the culture, I'm wondering if maybe we work for something that works with 7 people but won't work with like 15, or that works in one time zone but won't scale across a few, around the world.
So our leadership team is, our senior leadership team is distributed around the entire world. And so we have leaders in New Zealand, the west coast of Canada, east coast, and then GMT time zone. And I find that if there's something that we really need to get everybody on deck for, like usually 11 a.m. EST is the one that kind of works for us. And there's some people that have to make greater concessions than others in order to actually meet that, but we're not asking for that every single day, and we're very upfront about it, and it wasn't pushed on them. So I think if you have 7 people, that's actually a really great opportunity to sort of establish some of those boundaries. And like some of the folks up here said earlier, that might not work in 6 months from now, but establishing sort of the foundation of how you're going to work together, and that there's going to be some flexibility and some concessions from some people more than others, that would probably transcend pretty nicely throughout your growth culture anyways.
Cool. Thank you, that's helpful.
I think Andreas had mentioned that being on an hour-long video call sucks, and I was just wondering if being on a voice call would suck less, and if so, when?
Sorry, if a voice call sucks less than a video call?
Yeah.
I have no strong differences in sucking level here. It's like both sucks for me. The only recommendation I have on video calls is if you happen to have, for whatever reason, a lot of people in one location, like your hybrid team or whatever, have the people who are going to talk the most call into the call instead of sitting in that room. That usually creates a complete different way to actually everybody understands. You don't exclude people that much. So for example, what we do at larger meetings is that the person who's going to present is joining the call. The person who is most likely to talk the most, which is like, for example, the CEO, whoever, will also join the call over video, although they're in the same office as the rest of the people. Like, that's something I highly recommend. Other than that, prepare calls. Try to keep them at 30 minutes, 40 minutes max. Have clear action items afterwards, decisions afterwards. Because if you can't, after a call, point at least to some decisions, the calls feels even more frustrating if it's longer, right? So yeah. But I also am an engineer. Like maybe it's like almost like culturally expected for me to not like meetings and calls. So maybe I'm a little bit biased here.
Hello everyone, my name is Ivan, a software engineer from Bukalapak marketplace in Indonesia. So I have a question for Andreas. Did you do pair programming? Because as we know, pair programming is a good thing to do to increase team members' skill. If you don't do it, what is your recommendation?
Okay. It's actually one of my number one recommendations. So we had very bad experience with hiring remote in general. It was really, really hard to understand different CVs, different everything. So what we started doing was take-home challenges and pair programming as main path for actually evaluating people. So like a very simple take-home challenge, and the main idea of that take-home challenge is just to filter out people a little bit, but also get them to set up this small application locally, to get them to understand this application locally, and then join for like 40 minutes, 1 hour together, work on the same application and do something more complex in that application. We use this extensively as a hiring process. The main reason is I'm not a native speaker, and for some reason, native speakers always sound more intelligent to me. Like maybe it's a complex of mine, I don't know. But like if somebody's like really eloquent in speaking, like this guy, for example, like it just sounds more smart. So I regularly had this moment where I had like a person from San Francisco, and I'm like, holy shit, they are like this really sharp, really tech, like they speak startup, speak tech, and then I joined a call. I'm like, what just happened? We internally actually called this San Francisco Senior at some point, like this kind of experience. And like this is for hiring. So pair programming, amazing for hiring, and we also use it in Product Hunt, for example. We use it for onboarding people a bit, but also like in general, like irregularly. We have like this every few months. We have like projects where we intentionally put people together to start a project together, or like pair programming in general. I personally believe it's a completely undervalued technique in engineering. It's one of the most undervalued techniques in engineering.
Any recommendation for the tools?
I have no recommendation for the tools. We use video and editor.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think I have a similar question. My name is Umair. I'm from Toronto. The size of organization is about 500 employees. This is an engineering question. So we have 500 employees, 150 are engineers. As we are going remote, one of the problems that we have is the Canadian education system is very good, and so University of Toronto, Waterloo actually have exceptional engineers that we hire, that we get used to. The minimum bar of quality that we have is pretty high. So when we try to take that across the world, it's harder to hire because that bar is quite high in what we're used to. Is that a problem that I'm having, or you've had the same problem as well?
One thing that we realized is what we initially actually looked for is academic knowledge, which is very common in San Francisco, for example, like all these whiteboard tests and coding interviews and all this kind of stuff. Usually check if you did computer science education, and also like how you speak about stuff. It doesn't actually evaluate the things that you do in daily work. Like I had this discussion with a friend of mine who also does like mostly this kind of challenges, and he's like, yeah, but it's very simple. It's basically like he does like a game. Basically, you have to program as a test in front of him. And he's like, it's just basic multiplication of matrices, and like here you do this and that and here. And like, I never did this in my professional life in the last whatever years, right? So it might be a little bit wrong testing that comes here to play. So I would again recommend pair programming.
Tammy, maybe we can take the 3 questions and answer them. So
Collectively. Oh, I like that idea. Okay, so
they don't lose their
come on up, all of you, and just ask your questions, and then we'll have everybody respond, and that way at least you get some response.
So my question's around work-life balance. Do you have any tips or things that you do particularly, and also any specific policies in your companies around that?
All right. Work-life balance and policies.
Do you mean for like you specifically, or for your team?
Personally, like as the leader of a team or company.
Hi guys, I work in a company of 150 people, and around 40 are geographically distributed. And the mindset in the company is all activities and all fun initiatives are very HQ-centric. So how do you guys would promote a more inclusive and collaborative environment without being pushy or annoying or anything like that? Thanks.
Hi, my name's Kenny Hansen. I'm in the process of starting my first business. It's a service marketplace. And my question is around the challenges that a remote company create with external relationships. So we've talked a lot about engineering teams, business administration, but I know it's incredibly important when starting a business to create those relationships externally with your customers. So any strategies for getting started where you're distributed and you may not have the benefit of being face-to-face with your customers and establishing those relationships, creating that in-person feedback? Any advice on getting off the ground with that?
In Selina, wellness and surf, it's really important. We encourage people to learn how to surf and use our location, 70% off for every employee and 25 mandatory remote days to work, and take yoga classes. Every day there's a yoga class in our location, in our headquarters. If you've never done yoga, you will have it in Selina. So these two things.
Oh, the struggle is real. Yeah. I think like you don't be afraid of being pushy. It's not a bad thing. You can reframe it as it's if you really believe in remote work, it's also your responsibility to create a sense of urgency. And so maybe urgency is a little bit different than being pushy, but you have to have a sense of urgency, and then you have to have a plan once you've captured the attention so that you can kind of strike while the iron is hot. But you can't expect people to just adapt your own way of thinking. You have to become a teacher, you have to become an ambassador, you have to sort of integrate these things step by step, you know. But the urgency is sort of like, I would say, the biggest catalyst that you can ride. Right.
Throughout my professional career, I've lived in Cape Town, South Africa, which means it's a hell of a long way to fly anywhere. Throughout both business with teams and now Convergio, the bulk of our customers have been North American. I've not met any of them face to face. Not any, but sporadically, right? I don't think you need to. Like, you do not need FaceTime when you have Zoom, when you have email, right? Whatever. Like, you probably don't need that FaceTime. And customers don't care. With teams, nobody even knew we were based in Cape Town.
Great timing, everyone. Thanks for participating.